So I'm very pleased to be with you today and to have some human contacts with students, which is not so common. I'm going to share my experience of the Israeli Startup Nation. I worked in Israel for 4 years. I was managing the Office of Scientific and Academic Cooperation at the French Embassy. And then when I went back to France in 2019, the main question was, where should I find a place where life would be as nice as in Israel, as wonderful as in Israel? And I decided to live in Grenoble and to take profit of the mountain after the sea and the sun in Israel. I'm going to make an introduction of the Israeli Startup Nation. You said, Patrick, that Israel is one of the leading startup nation. My question is, maybe Israel is the only startup nation. Why do I say that? Do you know who has coined the concept of startup nation? Where did the word come from? Do you know? No. So it's a good point to start. Startup nation.
If you scroll or the arrow to the bottom.
Oh, sorry.
It's fine. It's because it's PDF, so.
Okay. Startup Nation is the title of a book written a few years ago, 10 years ago, by 2 authors to analyze the success of the Israeli innovation system. So the first use of the invention of the concept of Startup Nation was to talk about Israel. Why? Because Israel is the first country in the world for the number of startup nations per inhabitants. But the idea also is that Israel is maybe a nation like a startup, a nation that was created and developed like a startup. So today,
use your 2 fingers and swipe them up. 2 fingers from the bottom to the top.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I would like to. So Israel is considered as one of the most innovative countries in the world, and when you look at the data of the Bloomberg Innovation Index, what do you see? First, that Israel is considered the 7th in the world ranking. Second, that the main strength of Israel is in R&D. Israel is the first country in the world for R&D intensity, research concentration, but you also see that Israel has some improvements to do in some aspects of its ecosystem when you look at manufacturing or education system or productivity. What is very impressive when you live in Israel and when you work in Israel is to see that Israel is really an ecosystem. It means that you have all the actors that you need and they all work together. More than 7,000 startups, more than 300 structures that support the startups, 200 VCs, 400 R&D centers to 7 research universities. You have the support of the public authorities through the Israel Innovation Authority, and you have a specific role played by the army. So it's a very innovation ecosystem. And the second point that you really feel when you live and work in Israel is that innovation is really in the DNA of Israel. I will not elaborate on the key words I've brought on this slide. You can read them, but the most important is that you really feel that there is an entrepreneurship spirit in Israel. Now, I would like to focus on one point, which is very important, in my opinion, to understand Israel and the innovation in Israel. If you look at the investment of the government in R&D in Israel, and if you look at the share it represents in the GDP, and if you compare this data with the figures from France or OECD, for example, where will you find the highest investment in R&D of the government? In Israel or in France, let's say? What's your opinion?
Israel.
Okay, that's why it's important to talk about it, because it's higher in France. Why? Yes. Why? Here you have the figures. of the government finance expenditures in R&D in Israel, France, Korea, and OECD. Maybe you are surprised. Why? Because the main figure you have in mind is this one. Israel is the first country in the world for the expenses in R&D as a share of the GDP. It's almost 5%. It's number one in the world. But when you look at how is this R&D finance, and if you compare with, let's say, France, Korea, and OECD, what do you see? You see that more than 50% of the funding of R&D in Israel comes from abroad, mainly from multinationals. When I talked about the ecosystem, I mentioned the 400 R&D centers of multinationals. And this is very important to understand the ecosystem, the Israeli ecosystem, because it's an ecosystem which is open to the world. The funding comes from abroad, the market is abroad, and Israel developed technological partnerships with the world. So that's why I say here that we can describe Israel as a project factory for the world. Now, if we just have a look at the current situation, it's also important to have in mind that before the crisis, the economic fundamentals of Israel were very good. If you compare the unemployment rate or the evolution, the growth of the GDP, you say that the difference between France and Israel is 1 for 2. The unemployment rate, for example, was 3.8% before the crisis. It doesn't mean that you don't face any problem in Israel and you face a lot of poverty and inequalities and so on, but the growth, the unemployment rate and so on were good. And that's why when you look at the outlooks of here, the OECD, you see that the recovery of Israel will be slow, but they start with better fundamentals. What is important to have in mind is that, of course, there is an important impact on the economy and the ecosystem, but we see that there is confidence from the financial market, from the rating agencies, and from the investors. Maybe Cecile will elaborate on it, but it's very interesting to see that the growth of the funds that were raised continued in 2020. So, what is the situation now? I mean, in the world, we see evolution and we see more needs of technologies. Why? Because the state and the company want digitization. They search for self-sufficiency in strategic sectors, in the drugs, the food, electronic components. And we also have a very important new green agenda on the table. And what is interesting in Israel is that this ecosystem is in good position to face these issues. Why? First of all, because there is a very strong startup culture. And it was very interesting during the crisis to see that many startups evolved their activity to be able to fight against the crisis, the health crisis and the consequences of the health crisis. The Israeli ecosystem is also very tech-oriented. And it has this capacity to move from one sector to another one by using the technology in artificial intelligence, for example. So Israel is well positioned in strategic sectors. Israel is very B2B oriented. They work with companies all over the world. The main strength of Israel is not to develop B2C projects. So we can say that Israel has the capacities to really adapt to the situation and to tackle all the issues. However, Israel also has some challenges to take into consideration. I said that Israel is really open to the world, but it's also it's a strength, but it can be a weakness, particularly when you face a crisis. So now in Israel, I think that we can observe a trend to strengthen the links with the country, to have more action toward the local market, to encourage the Israeli institutional investors to invest in the tech sector, also to connect the traditional economy of Israel with the technology solutions. What is interesting also when you look at the economy in Israel is that you see kind of a dual economy, a very efficient tech sector and a traditional sector, a traditional economy, which is less productive than what you can see in the other countries of OECD. And Israel also develops as a startup nation. It means that they want to meet better the needs of the society and also an impact nation. And Cecile will talk about it. Israel also develops now as a scale-up nation. For a long time, the idea when we were creating a startup was to make an exit quickly. And now the evolution is that the exits are later and unicorns are created. And now Israel also become the first country in the world for the number of unicorns per inhabitant. The last point I would like just to mention, because it's also important to understand the country and the ecosystem, is that one issue is the balance between the different territories. So it's also important to develop what we call the peripheral regions of Israel, because today the ecosystem is really concentrated in Tel Aviv and a bit Jerusalem and Haifa, but really in the center of the country. The second issue is to include all the populations of Israel when we talk about tech. Some populations are underrepresented: the women, the Arabs, and the Orthodox Jews. And it's a political issue, it's an economical issue, and it's a social issue. So I really encourage all of you to develop projects with Israel, and you will see that it's a wonderful country to make entrepreneurship and innovation. And I also encourage you to pay attention to the big picture and to try to understand what this country is. So it's a pleasure to be with you today in GEM and to be with all of you online. And I think we'll also have the great chance to listen to Cecile.